why I quit my job at the wildlife rescue. Let's get straight into that. I've always been passionate about animals, even when I was a very young girl. I used to beg my parents repeatedly almost every week to take me to the zoo, and the family television was practically always tuned in to Animal Planet, much to the chagrin of my video game obsessed older brother. I wanted to go into veterinary medicine as a career, but the cost of schooling, amount of time it would take to get my degree, and frankly, grueling work hours eventually made it clear to me that that wouldn't be an option. Still, I made the best of the hand I was dealt, choosing to work at various animal shelters, non-profits and other organizations associated with animals. I even had a short stint working as a janitor at the zoo I used to be so excited to visit as a child that a commute was hell. I had to quit the last job because it turned out that behind the scenes of the zoo administration was taking far worse care of their animals than I would have liked, and I didn't feel comfortable being complicit in their mistreatment. In any event, this path in life eventually led me to work at a small wildlife rescue. It wasn't an especially glamorous position, and I would freely admit the pay was abysmal, but I had a chance to make a genuine difference in the world, and that made me happy. For every sick deer or injured goose we nursed back to health, I felt like I had real purpose. It wasn't always a particularly pleasant gig, if I'm being entirely honest. Even the most ardent nature lover will soon find that the task of saving wild animals begins to lose its luster. After week of squirrel bites and diseased bird shit. Nonetheless, I genuinely did enjoy my job. At least until that final night. The night that made me never want to work with animals ever again. You see, while we didn't have the staff to do this every night, when we had a chance we would have a skeleton crew run the graveyard shift, since a lot of the time would come in the next morning to find a half a dozen missed calls from people who wanted help with some nocturnal critter or another. I was happy for the extra pay, and most of the time things were fairly quiet, and so I had a chance to put up my feet and read a book, or mess about on my phone in between having frantic callers ask if they could bring in a bat that had flown into their home. That particular evening, I was pacing between social media apps on my phone out of boredom when we got a call from what sounded like a very distressed middle-aged man. This is the redacted wildlife rescue. How can I help you? Hi, I don't know how to put this exactly. I know it sounds crazy, but there's a wolf in my front yard. He was right. It did sound crazy. And from what I was aware, there were no wolves in this state outside of zoo animals, and I highly doubt it when I managed to escape captivity at my former place of employment and find its way over to this relatively isolated area. The place I lived in was not a large town by any means, little more than a couple of streets full of shops and surrounded by a vestigial suburb and some farmland. Sarah, you absolutely sure it's a wolf? We don't really have those around here. Significantly more likely to be just a stray dog or maybe a coyote at worst. I don't know for sure, but it's big, real big. If it's a dog, it's certainly the biggest one I've ever seen. There's something wrong with how it moves, like it's got a limp or something, but I can't quite put my finger upon it. I think it might only have 3 legs. I got the man's address and thanked him for his time before getting up to grab the other member of skeleton crew. Let's call him Jake. Jake had been there a little bit longer than me, and we generally got along pretty well. He used to be studying to become a veterinary technician, but the veterinary medicine made him a great asset, though he did sometimes make some very stupid decisions. I once had to stop him trying to grab a rattlesnake with his bare hands, just because he was so excited for an opportunity to catch a snake. However, the main reason I wanted him to accompany me was that he was quite a large man, and there was something about the whole situation, which from the get-go had made me very nervous. I felt a lot more comfortable bringing along someone who looked like he could bench press 400 pounds if he had to. And the farmhouse that the man had called from was only a quick drive away, maybe 15 minutes at most. At the time I thought that this was quite fortunate. While the full moon was shining bright enough for us to see the road fairly well, I never liked driving long distances on these country roads after dark. I always worried a deer or something might jump out in front of the wildlife rescue's crappy old van, or that it'd take a wrong turn or something like that. Fortunately for Jake and I, We arrived without any difficulties at the farmhouse. The animal was still there. I can't quite bring myself to say it was a wolf, not after what I experienced. It suddenly looked like one though, which was quite the shock. Both Jake and I let out a near simultaneous murmur of, "Holy shit," as we caught our first glimpse of the thing. Something people often forget is that wolves are big, up to 180 pounds at the largest. For comparison, huskies only get up to about 60 pounds at most. This thing, it was enormous. "Oh, that has to be a wolf. Where in hell is that thing just a stray dog?" mused Jack. "It might be a wolf dog," I suggested. "Doesn't quite look like a wolf, does it? There's something off about the proportions." Something about the thing's physiology bothered me, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. It just wasn't moving the way it should have. It reminded me of a video I'd seen a couple of months ago of an extremely realistic animatronic. Something made for an amusement park, I think. It was quite well crafted to be sure. It didn't even tick off the usual uncanny valley alarm bells when I looked at its face. But the movements weren't quite right. I felt the same way looking at the thing in front of the farmhouse. The animal was looking at us now, staring towards the van, its eyes glowing in the reflected beam from our headlights. It didn't run though, it just continued to pace looking at us. Jake and I were stepping out of the van at this point, not sure what the next course of action would be, but determined to do our best regardless. I found myself fiddling with my necklace as we approached, a gift from my grandfather. It's a makeshift medallion fashioned out of old silver dollar and suspended on a leather cord. He'd had a little hobby of making jewellery from old knickknacks, and at home I had a small collection of earrings, necklaces, bracelets and brooches and the like, all made from various random objects. He had unfortunately passed away a few years back, and I tried to wear at least something he'd made every day as a way to keep his memory alive. I recall him telling me after he gave me the medallion, "Now you'll be safe in a gunfight, so long as you wear this over your heart." And with a grandfatherly wink, as if I was at any risk of being a victim of Old West banditry in the 21st century. I was snapped out of my idle remembering by the sound of Jake's voice, though I didn't quite catch what he said. I muttered, indicating that he should repeat himself. "Well," I said, "it's gotta be someone's pet. Some rich guy bought himself a 3-legged wolf dog and it got out of the house, maybe," he said. Now that we were a little closer, it was clear that the animal was only walking on 3 legs, though it moved about with quite a degree of dexterity, as though it had long grown used to the condition. I kept pacing back and forth, just looking at us. Its eyes were a brilliant blue, which was a definite tip-off that whatever this thing was, it wasn't a proper wolf. And when it came to canines, blue eyes are strictly a trait of dogs. Well, it was something else I noticed though. Its tail wasn't quite right. It seemed too stiff and a bit too long. Suddenly, it clinked in my brain what was wrong with it. "It's not missing a leg. Look," I said, pointing. "It's just sticking out one of its hind legs. Or maybe it's wounded or something like that." As if in response to my words, the wolf dog stopped pacing, looking directly at me specifically. I could feel when it made eye contact with me, those blue eyes boring into my own. I could have sworn I saw its lips turn up slightly at the edges, forming a mischievous grin. It lowered its previously extended hind leg to the ground slowly, deliberately. It didn't have a tail at all. I doubt that it ever did. And then it began to limp towards us, whimpering softly. How to describe what it sounded like? It's a little difficult. I heard an anecdote once from an online acquaintance who worked with birds regarding an old crow. This particular crow had taken a mocking acorn in a human voice. Someone must have been trying to talk to the bird, but crudely imitating the crow's own cries, to which the wily corvid had mirrored back their own mimic cry, like a language native speaker mocking someone with a foreign accent by repeating a particularly egregious mispronunciation. The wolf dog sounded like something copying a human copying a dog. Its whimpers were artificial, stilted, almost campy. It sent shivers up my spine immediately. But Jake didn't seem to notice. "You're right. He's definitely hurting, Judging from how it's reacting to us, I'd certainly wager he's somebody's lost pet. I hope we take him back to the rescue and try to contact the domestic animal shelter in the morning. I'm not sure we can find a cage that will fit him just for one night," said Jake, sounding almost enthusiastic. I noticed how quickly the animal had changed from a it to a he. Well, humans will start bonding with anything if it seems pitiful. Jake held out a hand for the thing to sniff. "Jake, don't," I started to say, about to warn him that it was equally likely the thing was so seemingly friendly due to rabies. But before the words could leave my lips, the animal was already licking his hand meekly. "Ah, come on, boy," Jake said in a playful tone. "Let's get you in the van. Then we'll get you some treats when we get back to the rescue." Jake led the animal back to the van, talking to it in a goofy sing-song tone of voice, as though it was his own beloved childhood dog, while it made a faux whines and pretended to limp. I couldn't understand why he couldn't tell that something was wrong with it. From behind, I could see very clearly there was no sign of docking or anything else that could have resulted in the wolf dog's tail being removed. It was as though it was born without one. It was something else too, something I couldn't put my finger on, about its legs. It felt like I was missing something obvious, like when a word is at the tip of your tongue, but you can't remember it. The whole thing was frankly making me sick to my stomach. The drive back to the rescue was uneventful, aside from Jake gushing about how adorable his newfound friend was. It's not that I'm not a dog person. I have no issues with them at all. I love animals of all sorts. But this thing, it wasn't a dog, nor was it a wolf, nor anything in between. I kept catching the reflection of its eyes in a rearview mirror, staring at me through the caged-off back of the van. I didn't like its eyes, piercing blue like those of a human being's. I could have sworn at once, just once, it winked at me. One might wonder why I didn't voice my concerns to Jake, but the simple truth is this. What was I supposed to say? It's not like there was any concrete I could point to beyond bad vibes, and I could hardly tell him to stop the van and kick the animal out onto the side of the road, could I? And so, ultimately, I swallowed down my fear and tried very hard to convince myself that there was nothing at all the matter. We reached the wildlife rescue without incident, and Jake opened the back doors to the van, patting at his legs to direct the wolf dog to come out. The thing made a pathetic scene, whimpering as though afraid that jumping down the foot or two out of the van's back would hurt its supposedly wounded leg, though from what I could see there didn't look to be any injuries whatsoever. Ultimately, Jake wound up assisting the thing out of the van, lifting it gently down while it whined and yelped in that terrible, mocking voice. And Jake begrudgingly put a collar and leash around the animal's neck, only at my insistence, complaining that it was obviously tame and that he was sure it would behave itself, but I wouldn't hear of it. If he wanted to adopt the damn thing, that was on his own business. He still needed to follow basic safety precautions. We guided the thing into the kennels, where we nudged it inside the largest one, a cage we usually reserve for injured deer. It whined more of this perceived injustice, staring up in an over-the-top, performative sadness at Jake as he turned the key to the lock inside. "Ah, poor thing. I'm going to get him some water and food. You wait here and keep an eye on him," Jake said, not giving me time to respond before leaving the kennels to acquire the supplies for our guests. As soon as Jake left the room, the animal stopped its whining nearly instantly. I think it could tell I wasn't falling for its act. It just stared at me. But once again, I could see that faint, terrible smile on its face. And a wolf dog wasn't the only occupant of the kennels that evening. There was a raccoon, a bobcat, and a goose. All of them seemed terrified of the thing. The bobcat and goose were hissing, and the raccoon's tail was waving back and forth wildly. I'd always been told I had more empathy for animals than people, and as I stood there, being stared at by this not-wolf, I wondered if maybe that was why I instinctively was repelled by it in the same way that other patients in the wildlife rescue were. It didn't feel like an animal. It felt like ages just standing there, looking at this thing, smiling, mocking. This thing shaped in a parody of a canine. In the bright light of the kennel, I could see it much clearer, and the longer I looked, the more queasy I felt. I won't go over all the hideous quirks or proportions that made the thing look so uncanny, because frankly, most people wouldn't notice. And dogs come in all shapes and sizes, and it would take someone with a particular eye for this sort of thing to understand what I would even be talking about. And to this day, I still don't understand how Jake couldn't see it for what it truly was. With his education, he ought to have been able to notice. I will mention one thing though, something which especially made my skin crawl. Beneath the fluorescent light, I could finally tell what had been bothering me about its legs. Wolves, dogs, and other canines all have digitigrade legs. That is to say that they walk upon their toes. It basically means that their limbs have an extra joint on which to bend, which is generally more useful for quadrupedal motion. In contrast, humans have plantigrade legs. We walk on the soles of our feet. This animal's legs were plantigrade. This can happen sometimes in dogs. It is a deformity which is known to occur, but this thing didn't look deformed. It didn't seem to have any trouble walking, despite its act with Jake. It just moved as though it were a human being crawling about on all fours. It was around the same time as I had this realization that Jake entered the room with food and water for our guest, and I excused myself to go sit at a reception desk and try to convince myself everything was fine. It's just a weird dog. There's nothing to worry about. You're probably just tired. Your mind is playing tricks on you. I kept thinking to myself, my internal monologue working overtime to wash away my discomfort, while I fiddled with the medallion my grandfather made. The terrible thing is, it was so close to the end of our shift when it happened. The sun was due to start rising in half an hour, and we would have been replaced by the morning crew. We were almost done. We were almost safe. Jake and I had been finishing up our last remaining task before we had to head off for the morning, when we heard an awful racket coming from the kennels. It was a terrible feline yowling, mixed with a frantic honking of a goose, followed shortly afterwards by the smashing of glass. Jake immediately began sprinting towards the sound, while I called out for him to wait. I grabbed some bite-proof gloves and a heavy apron, swearing all the while about having to deal with the stupid bobcat right before the end of my shift. While I was putting them on, I heard an awful, strangled scream. I recognized its owner at once. Something had happened to Jake. My first instinct was to sigh in annoyance. Obviously the idiot got himself bitten, I thought to myself as I stomped my way to the kennels, grumbling all the while. I told you to wait, you moron, I started to say as I opened the door. It was dark in the kennels. The only illumination came from the window, the pale moonlight glinting against the shattered glass of the fluorescent bulb strewn across the blood-soaked floor. And silhouetted against the window was a tall figure, facing away from me. It was holding something. I could hear the terrified chatter of a raccoon. "Jake?" I asked timidly as I walked into the room. My foot collided with something lying on the floor. I looked down to see a human body, face down upon the ground, blood dripping from its torn-out throat. Laying next to Jake's corpse were the similarly mangled bodies of a bobcat and a goose. There was a pained screeching, followed by a snap of bones, and then a moment of utter silence. I stared in petrified horror at the thing standing upright in the moonlight, its dog-like head turning to look at me with an awful smile etched unnaturally across its inhuman face. The silence was interrupted with a wet thump of the raccoon's body joining the other corpses on the gore-smeared linoleum. I don't want to think about its voice, its real voice, not the wretched, terrible mockery of a wolf dog that had made it gain Jake's trust. Its laughter was vicious, mocking, evil. In all of my life, I never heard any sound so deeply cruel. And the thing began to walk towards me. I tried to back away, but I slipped on the blood, falling in a heap as I started to hyperventilate. And it got closer, close enough that the light from the corridor let me see the look of hunger and contempt in its monstrously human eyes. He reached a gore-soaked claw towards me, chuckling darkly as he prepared to reduce me to nothing but meat. But, as the thing was just about to touch me, inches away from tearing into my jugular, it let out a surprised yelp of pain. It recoiled from me, eyeing a medallion around my neck with frustration and hatred. My mind flashed back to when my grandfather gave it to me, and what I said to him in response. A gunfight, Papa? Really? I'd probably get more use out of it for fighting off werewolves. The monster huffed and growled before leaping over me and tearing down the hallway in a blur of blood-stained fur. I heard the smashing of wood and glass when it crashed through the front door of the wildlife rescue, letting out a mocking imitation of a wolf's howl as it fled into the waning darkness of the rapidly fading night. And when my co-workers found me in the kennel, paralyzed with fear and covered in Jake's blood, they immediately called the police. And based on all the evidence they found at the scene, coupled with my admittedly somewhat hysterical account of the thing that did it, they put the whole affair down to being the work of a rabid wolfdog. They informed animal control, but of course, nobody ever found anything. I never bothered showing up to work at the wildlife rescue again after that, and I've been working a shitty retail job ever since. Well, the pay is awful, the hours are lousy, and the work is demeaning, but that doesn't matter. All that's important is that the schedule is flexible enough that I never have to keep working after sunset whenever there is a full moon. I spend those nights at home with the door locked and bolted, clutching my grandfather's silver dollar medallion and praying I don't hear that mocking voice pretending to whimper outside the door to my apartment. Wow. Suddenly another one. Wow. Chest pounding, absolutely intriguing story there. From the incredible mind of PriestessOfSpiders from over on Reddit, No Sleep. A big thank you, Priestess, for allowing me to narrate this incredible story. Very, very creepy, and of course I hope you enjoy my rendition and look forward to more of your work in the future. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Well, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. Now, if you can pen a story packing that much bite, that much punch, then please do get in touch with me at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you're all well and happy, guys. Had a fantastic week at work or school, whatever it is that you do, and I hope you're taking a fight back to life. But above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.